I had been in worse situations, Afghanistan, Fallujah, even that op in South Sudan where I had to lie in mud for 72 hours. But nothing felt quite as bizarre as being handcuffed in a quiet federal courtroom wearing a clean suit. It started with a parking violation that wasn't even mine. They said I matched a description. Next thing I knew, I was escorted out of my truck outside the courthouse and brought inside, like a suspect in a felony case. One of the marshals kept glancing at me like I was supposed to explain myself. But I'd learned long ago, silence was a weapon. So I waited. They didn't recognize me. Not as a decorated Marine sniper with a chest full of ribbons. Not as a man who'd been saluted more times than he could count. Just another face they assumed didn't belong in a courtroom without standing trial. Until the courtroom door opened, and everything changed. The courtroom had been buzzing faintly with paperwork shuffles and the occasional cough. But when the heavy oak doors creaked open, that quiet shattered like glass. Every uniform in the room, deputies, clerks, even the presiding judge, snapped their heads toward the back. Boots echoed. Purposeful. Heavy. Calm. A 4-star general stepped inside. He wore full-dress blues, his chest a mosaic of medals. The rows of ribbons spoke of decades of sacrifice, from deserts to jungles to oceans most civilians never knew we touched. You could almost hear the air get tighter. The general didn't speak at first. Just looked around the room, eyes scanning each person like he was taking inventory. When his gaze finally landed on me, sitting there in cuffs like a common criminal, his face hardened. He turned to the judge. "Your Honor," he said, his voice cutting clean through the silence, "I'm here for him." Gasps. A bailiff almost dropped his notepad. The judge blinked. "You know this man, General?" The general stepped forward, nodding. "Know him? I trained him. And this," he motioned to the cuffs, "is a disgrace to everything he's given this country." For a moment, no one moved. The courtroom was frozen between disbelief and confusion. The judge leaned forward, clearly rattled. "General, with all due respect, this man was brought in due to an ongoing investigation." "We were told he matched what?" the general interrupted, calm but firm. "A vague description. A vehicle tag from another state. Did anyone here bother to run his clearance level or check his military status?" No answer. He turned to the bailiff. "Remove those cuffs." The bailiff hesitated. You could tell he wasn't used to being given orders by someone who could have commanded a combat division. "Now," the general said. This time, there was no room for debate. The bailiff moved quickly, keys jingling. My wrists were freed, but I didn't rub them. I just looked at the general and gave a small nod. "Thank you, sir." He nodded back but didn't take his eyes off the bench. "I came here today for a ceremony at Arlington," he said, addressing the whole room now. "Instead, I got a call from his lawyer, telling me that a decorated Marine Corps sniper, with multiple commendations, was sitting in cuffs like a common thug. No warning. No evidence. Just assumptions." He paused. "And let me be crystal clear, you didn't just disrespect a Marine. You disrespected the entire institution." The room went dead silent. Judge Hallberg adjusted his glasses, clearly shaken. "General, this is highly irregular. We follow due process here." "With all due respect, Your Honor," the general said, stepping closer to the bench, "due process should have started with basic identification. Did anyone here ask for his military ID? Did anyone question why a man in a veteran's license plate truck, in a tailored suit, would be treated like a car thief?" The silence was answer enough. My lawyer, finally finding his voice, rose from his seat. "Your Honor, we intend to file a formal complaint. This was not just a clerical error. My client was publicly detained, mishandled, and humiliated." The judge tried to regain control. "We can sort this out through internal review." "No, sir," the general cut in. This isn't internal. This is national. He's one of ours. He served this nation with honor in 5 deployments. He took a bullet in Ramadi. You think you're just going to hand-wave this as procedure? Not today. The general reached into his coat pocket and placed a folded letter on the bench. Classified clearance file. Signed off by the Pentagon. That man, he pointed to me, was set to brief members of Joint Special Operations Command next week. And you had him chained like a threat. Judge Hallberg slowly picked up the letter, scanning the first page. His face paled. He looked at me. Sergeant, Gunnery Sergeant, the general corrected coldly. Gunnery Sergeant, the judge continued, swallowing hard. I offer my sincere apologies. But the general shook his head. This isn't over. Not even close. The courtroom buzzed with an unspoken tension. You could feel it thick in the air, like the calm right before a battlefield detonation. The general turned to me. Do you want to pursue this, Gunny? I didn't answer immediately. I looked at the judge, then the marshals who had brought me in, then back at the general. My jaw was tight, but my voice was level. I want accountability, sir. For every vet who doesn't have a 4-star to walk through that door. That hit the room like a shot. The general gave a tight nod. Understood. He turned to the clerk. Contact the Department of Defense Liaison for Legal Affairs. Use my name. This court will be hearing from Washington directly. The clerk froze. Sir, it's already been authorized, the general interrupted. You're just making the call. As the clerk moved like he was walking on ice, I turned to my lawyer. Make sure we request the surveillance footage, I muttered. Oh, we will, he said. They'll be handing over more than footage by the time this is done. At that moment, a marshal re-entered the room, holding a phone. Your Honor, he said, almost whispering. There's someone from the Pentagon on line 1. They're asking about this incident. The judge stood there, stunned. He didn't even reach for the phone yet. The general leaned in slightly. Go ahead, Your Honor. You'll want to take that. Judge Hallberg slowly picked up the receiver, his hand visibly trembling. No one spoke while he listened. Just the faint murmur of a voice on the other end, firm, clipped, and clearly giving instructions. After a tense 30 seconds, the judge cleared his throat. Yes, I understand. Of course. Immediately. He hung up and looked out over the courtroom like a man who had just realized he was standing on thin ice, and the cracks had started. He didn't look at me. He looked at the general. They have directed this court to issue a formal statement of apology and to release all records associated with Gunnery Sergeant Langston. Immediately. They've also requested an internal audit on procedural detainment. The general gave a single nod. And the marshals? He asked coldly. The Department of Justice is sending inspectors, the judge said quickly. They'll handle that. The general turned to me. Satisfied? I stood up, slow and steady, brushing off my sleeves. Not yet, sir. But this is a start. He smirked slightly, barely there. Still calm under pressure. That's why we picked you for recon. The judge finally looked at me. Sergeant. I had no idea, with all due respect, Your Honor, I said quietly, you never asked. You could feel it, something had shifted. The authority in the room no longer belonged to the judge. It didn't belong to the bailiffs or the clerks or even the prosecutors. It belonged to the general and, oddly enough, to me. The same marshals who had escorted me in now stood back, unsure of themselves, avoiding eye contact. The courtroom gallery, once indifferent, now watched with a mix of awe and quiet shame. My lawyer leaned over and whispered, "We're going to have leverage now. Real leverage." But that wasn't what I was thinking about. I looked at the flag beside the judge's bench. I'd bled under that flag. Buried brothers beneath it. Carried it into zones where no one else would go. And now, here in a courtroom in my own country, it had taken a 4-star general's entrance to remind these people what that flag was supposed to stand for. The general stepped beside me, speaking quietly so only I could hear. You handled that with restraint. That matters more than they'll ever understand. I've seen worse, I said. I know, he replied. But they haven't. And today, they just got educated. He turned to leave, but before he did, he stopped and looked directly at the judge one final time. Next time you put cuffs on someone, make damn sure you know who you're dealing with. And with that, he walked out, shoulders squared, boots thudding like distant thunder. I followed the general out of the courtroom, every pair of eyes tracking us like they were watching something historic. And maybe, in a way, they were. Each step felt like reclaiming something, dignity, respect, a place that shouldn't have been questioned to begin with. In the hallway, 2 young MPs stood at attention. They snapped a sharp salute the moment the general approached. Without missing a beat, he returned it, then turned to me. You ride with me, he said. Understood, sir. As we walked toward the exit, reporters swarmed the front doors, their cameras already flashing through the glass. The general leaned over just slightly. Want me to clear them out? I shook my head. Let them watch. Let them film. Maybe it'll make someone think twice next time. Outside, the sun was sharp against the marble steps. We stopped at the top, side by side. I noticed the general paused, just briefly, to look at the flag overhead. You know, he said, they always say the battlefield ends when you come home. But I've learned, sometimes, the hardest battles are fought in silence, in suits, in rooms like that. I nodded. And not all enemies carry rifles. He looked at me then, really looked. You ever think about going back in? Not combat. Policy. Oversight. We need men like you where it counts. I took a breath, letting the thought settle. Maybe, I said. If it means fewer of us end up in cuffs for doing nothing wrong. He smiled. That's exactly why I asked. We made our way down the courthouse steps as the cameras flashed and microphones extended in every direction. Reporters fired off questions, names, ranks, what had just happened inside, but neither of us spoke. Sometimes silence carries more weight than sound. A black government SUV waited at the curb. The general opened the door for me first. Still leading from the front, sir? I asked with a smirk. He grinned. Some habits don't break. Get in. As we pulled away, the courthouse shrank in the rearview mirror, but the moment didn't. It lingered, heavy, unfinished. My phone buzzed quietly in my pocket, messages from fellow Marines, old commanders, even one from a Pentagon aide. Word had spread fast. Back at the military compound, I was brought into a quiet, secure office. Waiting on the desk was a single folder, stamped with the seal of the Department of Defense. Inside, a proposal. Civilian transition into advisory leadership. Direct access to oversight boards. Influence over procedural reforms in federal institutions. A quiet position, on paper. But in practice, a chance to protect others who didn't have someone to walk into a courtroom for them. The general stood across from me, arms folded. You don't have to decide now, he said. But I already knew. I'll do it, I said. Good, he replied. Because today wasn't about fixing one mistake. It was about making sure it doesn't happen again. 2 weeks later, I stood in front of a room full of brass, generals, admirals, civilian defense executives. All eyes were on me. But I wasn't nervous. I told them everything that happened. Every detail of the courthouse. Every hesitation, every oversight. Not to shame individuals, but to expose a pattern. One that could have ended worse for someone without my history, without that phone call, without a general willing to stand up and walk into a courtroom. When I finished, the room was dead silent. Then came a slow clap from the back. The general stepped forward and stood beside me. "This is what leadership looks like," he said. "Not rank. Not medals. But action." The policies began to shift. Detainment procedures were revised. Military ID databases were linked across departments. A federal oversight board for veteran-related civilian encounters was established, quietly, but effectively. And somehow, I found myself at the table, chair pulled out and waiting. I didn't do it for recognition. I did it for the guy who wouldn't have a general walk through that door. For the ones who'd be dismissed, profiled, overlooked. Because I'd been all of that in a single morning, and I wasn't going to let it happen again. And now, when I walk into a courtroom, or a boardroom, or even a gas station in a suit, people still don't always know who I am. But that's the point. Let them underestimate me. It just makes it easier to flip the whole room upside down, when it matters most. Weeks passed. Headlines faded. But the impact didn't. I started getting letters, emails from Marines I'd served with, others I'd never met. Some told me about times they'd been questioned, detained, passed over. Others just said, "Thank you, not for what I said, but for being seen." What surprised me most was one message that came from a young law student who'd been sitting in that courtroom the day it all unfolded. She wrote, "I came to observe a routine hearing. What I saw changed how I understand power. You didn't raise your voice. You didn't need to. That general walked in for you, but you never once looked small. That courtroom was yours, even in cuffs." I didn't reply right away. I didn't know how to respond to something like that. But her words stuck with me. Because the truth is, my uniform may have changed. No more boots, no more field gear. But the mission hadn't. Now I wore a suit. Now my weapon was policy, reform, presence. The battlefield looked different, but the fight was the same. To be respected. To protect those who serve. To remind people that valor doesn't vanish just because the war ends. That day in court. It wasn't about justice for me. It was a message. For every Marine. Every soldier. Every veteran. You're not invisible. And if someone forgets who you are, we'll remind them. Together.